Good afternoon, everybody. I can't tell you how happy I am that you're here today. I was with a session at 4 p.m. on the last day of a conference, and a topic as compelling as COPPA compliance. I was fully prepared for it to be the cameraman and I. So just up front, the good news about being the last session of the day is I can take a little extra time to get through this. But any discussion of COPPA can quickly get into the weeds. I'm going to cover the high points of COPPA today, but I'll hang around after the session and answer any detailed questions you might have, okay? First off, I want to dispel a couple of misconceptions about COPPA. COPPA is not about protecting children from individuals that would do them harm on the web. It's not about protecting children from inappropriate material. COPPA is about privacy. Specifically, COPPA is intended to give parents control over what information is collected from their children, how that information is used, and who they can share that information with. It only applies to data collected online. So from a practical matter, that means if your application is downloaded by a child and only used offline after they download that application, COPPA does not apply to you. It also only applies to children inside the US. It doesn't matter where your app originates from, doesn't matter where your server is, doesn't matter if the child is a US citizen. If they're under age 13 and they're in the US, COPPA applies to you. Okay, in a minute I'm going to show you a slide that talks specifically about what the FTC considers to be personally identifiable information. But I encourage you to keep this broader definition in mind because this is the way the FTC is going to view what you do with your application, right? Now, with the Internet of Things right around the corner, it doesn't take a big leap of an imagination to imagine a bicycle or a backpack with geolocation in it, a unique identifier, and being web connected. And there's no doubt in my mind when that happens, and that may be 6 months from now, the FTC will view the ID in that knapsack as being personally identifiable information. So always keep the broader definition in mind. Here's a comprehensive list of what the FTC considers to be personally identifiable information today. Okay? At the top of this list, I think there's some obvious things there. Name, telephone number, social security number, address. Down near the bottom of the list are the things that have been added since COPPA was revised in July of last year. And the most onerous of those is obviously persistent identifiers. A persistent identifier is a cookie, a unique device identifier, or any technology that allows you to track that child over time and across websites or applications. Another interesting one is photo, video, or audio file. If you capture any recording of a child, and it doesn't have to be the child who's using your application. If that child captures an audio recording of another child under age 13 and shares that socially through your application, the FTC is going to want to speak to you about that, okay? Geolocation data. If you've been following this at all, that's been a big one for many applications out there because there's so much you can do with that information. You can make your games more engaging. You can make them bring those users back, okay? So the question you need to ask is, does COPPA apply to you today, or is it likely to apply to you sometime in the future? It's really a pretty easy determination to make. If you collect, use, or share any personal identifiable information from a child under age 13, or if any plugin in your application does the same, you fall under COPPA. It's pretty straightforward. Another important determination for you to make is whether or not your application is what the FTC will designate as directed to children. And the reason this is important is because if they determine that your application is directed to children, then every user of your application must be provided with COPPA protection. Right? Now, the way that the FTC is going to make that determination is going to be a multitude of things. They're going to look at the content of your application, what sort of things you allow the users to do, what sort of colors you use, what sort of characters you've got in there, if you've got references to child celebrities. All of this will be taken into consideration. If there's any doubt in your mind, ask 4 or 5 of your friends to look at your application. If they tell you they think it's directed to children, the FTC will probably come to the same conclusion. Okay. If you don't fall into that category, you're a general audience application. You've got the option to use actual knowledge is the criteria that comes into play as far as the FTC is concerned. Actual knowledge is a very simple concept to understand. If you've got knowledge that there's a child under the age of 13 using your application, COPPA applies. Now you have the option to use an age gate. You can use the age gate either to exclude children under age 13 from your application, or you can use that to get the actual knowledge so that you now treat children differently than you treat your general user. Okay? Verifiable parental consent. This is the most painful part of COPPA by a long shot, right? This is what you must obtain from a parent before you can collect any personally identifiable information from that child. And this is the biggest bump in the road, I think, for most application developers in terms of getting over COPPA. There is an exception to this. There are a few exceptions to this, actually. If you are collecting only a persistent identifier and you only use that for the internal operation of your application, you're clear. COPPA does not apply to you. But that's a pretty narrow definition to stay within. There are a couple other exceptions for one-time or multiple usage. What that applies to is, let's say a child is using your application. They want to participate in a game or a raffle or something of that nature, and you need to contact them to let them know whether they won the game. Under that specific circumstance, you're allowed to collect their email address or some other contact information so that you can reach out to them. But as soon as you reach out to them at the end of that game, you must delete that contact information. The FTC is very specific about these things. Okay, verifiable parental consent consists of two key components. The first is a direct notice to parents. This notice has to contain, and the FTC is very specific about this. They lay it out in very clear language. You need to provide them with all the information they need to make an informed decision about whether or not to grant your application consent. After the direct notice is delivered, you need to verify that the parent is an adult. The FTC is very specific about the methods that you can use to do that today. I'll go over that in the next slide. Actually, they're a little broader. They have a broad specification saying that you can use any method as long as it is reasonably calculated in light of available technology to ensure that the person granting consent is the parent of the child. It's actually a very good sentence. The reality is that nobody goes anywhere except for the methods that are on the approved list with the FTC. It just scares everybody away, okay? So this is some of the information that must be contained in that direct notice to the parents that I mentioned to you before. Like I said, if you're going to take this on yourself, you need to read the FTC specifications in detail and make sure that you get this right, okay? One item that is often missed by people is right under how they can provide consent. The next one there, you must provide an option for a parent to grant consent for you to collect personal information from that child without sharing it with anyone else, right? That means no social sharing. They can't share anything with their friends. You can't share it with ad networks. And you must have that in the direct notice to parents. Okay, here's a list of FTC-approved verification methods, and I've got a little editorial in here. But most commonly used, or right up top, is debit or credit card purchase. And this must involve a purchase transaction. It can't just be collecting the debit or credit card number from the parent. And the reason for this is the FTC wants to see a line item on the parent statement so the parent has some indication that someone has used their card to grant consent to their child. And obviously what they're worried about there is that the kids got the card, and the email they sent for the request they sent to themselves, they pull out their parent's card, they type in the number, and they're off and running, right? Government ID, it could be a driver's license. More typically, it'll be a name, address, and last four of the social, okay? As you go down the list, they get to be a little bit more high friction. Signed consent returned by fax or mail. It's going to be a bit of a challenge if you want to get the parent to print that form off, fill it out, and send it in to you. And then you've got the administrative responsibility of keeping track of that, right? Knowledge-based questions, these are questions, I think you're familiar with them. They're used pretty commonly today. You ask the parent questions about where they had a mortgage or where they used to live, things that a child won't know, and you can use that as a way to verify that they are the parent. Down at the bottom of the list, these are on the FTC's approved methods, but call a toll-free number staffed by trained personnel, connect to a trained personnel via video conference. I don't think so. I've never seen that used by anyone, and I don't expect to see it anytime soon. Email Plus. Email Plus is a special case of parental consent that only applies if the PII that you're using is for internal operations only, right? It's a simpler method. It involves a two-step process, the first being notification sent to the parent using email, letting them know that the child wants to share information with the application. And then you need to follow up by some secondary means. It could be another email a week later, a phone call, anything you can come up with to verify that the parent knows that consent has been granted, okay? But again, that only applies if you're only using that information for internal operations. The good news is there's a growing number of services out there today that will do the heavy lifting for you. They will provide parental consent services for you so you don't have to deal with this. What they do is make sure that it's COPPA compliant. They make sure that that direct notice to the parent contains all the information that it must have to be in compliance with the FTC's requirements. It'll handle the parental ID verification, event the logs, and they also have onboard reporting. A side benefit from this is if it's done correctly, this presentation by these services to the parents can be done in a standard format, in a very user-friendly format that parents will become much more familiar with. Familiarity will breed acceptance, right? It's not always what you ask of someone, it's how you ask it. So if you ask it in the right way and you're exchanging value to that parent and they believe that, they're going to grant you consent. So rather than develop it yourself, I suggest you look into these third-party services. I think this is a pretty accurate representation of where the COPPA compliance state of affairs has been since about 2000, right? Basically, compliance by avoidance. Now, as with the changes that came in July of last year, this is a much more difficult place to be, right? And there's a few questions I think you should ask yourself. I understand that there are applications out there that have, they can achieve their objectives without collecting personal information from the children. And if you can do that, more power to you. That's a great thing. But if you need that personal information in order to either make your game more engaging, to monetize, for better retention, whatever your objective is, I suggest that you don't get on the end of that line because it's a missed opportunity. It's Disney doesn't get on that line. Disney recognizes the value of building a relationship with the parent of that child and try to establish trust with their brand so that you're going to be comfortable allowing that child to use your application. Right? Why miss an opportunity to engage with the parent? Yes, having to get parental consent is a bump in the road in terms of onboarding your kids, right? But if your objective is just downloads, then this is a big problem for you. But if your objective is monetization or engagement, why would you miss an opportunity to establish a relationship based on trust with that parent? Let me put it another way. That parent is the chief financial officer for that kid and for other kids as well. So it's an opportunity for you to build trust there. And in the long run, I think that'll help you achieve your objectives. So, again, this is kind of repeating what I already said. Ask yourself the question, if it were easy to get parental consent and cost-effective to get parental consent, how would that improve your ability to achieve your objectives, whatever your objectives might be? Okay? So, what are your options? Let's say for the moment that you've decided that you want to get access to that child's information because you can do some good things with that, both for yourself and for the child. There's really only two options open to you. You can go with one of the 6 designated safe harbors by the FTC. There's some real benefits to going this route. First of all, they understand COPPA thoroughly. They'll guide you through the entire process. That includes verifiable parental consent and that your policies are correct. Everything that you need to be COPPA compliant. Some, but not all of these safe harbors have a VPC solution. But if you're doing it yourself, they'll advise you on making sure that that VPC solution is COPPA compliant. The negative is they come at a cost. If you're an independent developer, chances are a safe harbor may not be the route you want to go. It can be kind of expensive. But if you've got a lot of properties out there, you're a big publisher, safe harbor is an insurance policy. If you are contracted with a safe harbor and they've certified you to be COPPA compliant, the FTC will not take action against you. So if that's worth the price of admission to you, then it's a good route to go. The alternative is you can do this yourself. It's not that difficult, really. First of all, you need to understand COPPA cold. And if you don't, contract somebody who does or bring that expertise in-house. I suggest you go to the FTC's FAQs. In fact, if you want to understand COPPA, I would recommend you start with the FAQs. And if you read through those, you will have a very good understanding of COPPA. It's an excellent resource in terms of how to implement this. Some obvious things: be open, clear, and transparent regarding your information usage practices. That's the best practice in any case, but particularly when you're dealing with children, you need to go that way. Get your privacy policy in order. This is extremely important. Don't use a standard privacy policy. Make sure that you are crystal clear in your privacy policy, what information you're going to collect from that child, who you're going to share it with, what you're going to do with that. And don't just think about what you're going to do with that information today. Think 6 months, a year down the road, because if you were to publish a policy and you were to get 100,000 users out there on board having their parents approve based on that policy, and now you make a material change to that policy, you need to go back to every one of those parents and get consent again. You don't want to do that. So get it right the first time, okay? Obtaining VPC, like I said, is going to be your greatest challenge. That's where all the pain is. That's where the cost is. So you've got 2 options. Look at third-party services or develop it and administer it yourself. And I wasn't completely honest with you. There is one more option, but I think it could be your most costly, so I don't recommend you go there. That's it. So I'll take any questions you have. No questions.
Hello. So I had a question about the email plus.
Mm-hmm.
So you said that applies only if it is if the data is collected only for internal operations.
Right.
But, and maybe I just misunderstood, but it seemed like that was one of the exceptions on one of the previous slides. Is that not the case?
Yeah. No, the exception on the previous slide is you don't have to get parental consent. If you are only collecting a unique identifier and you're only going to use it for the internal operations of the website, only that unique identifier, only a persistent identifier. Email Plus applies to all information you might collect from that child, provided you're only going to use it for the internal operations of the website. Good question. It's a fine point. Right on.
So I'm curious about Facebook in particular, because I know a lot of people who let their children get on Facebook,
Sure.
and some apps and games and whatnot use Facebook as like a login.
Sure.
So like, are there any issues related to that, and like how would you be able to overcome those? Because that seems like a potential for liability right there.
Well, it's a wonderful question. We could easily do a whole session on that. It's not an issue for us here. It's an issue for Facebook, really. And Facebook has done just what everybody else has done in that cartoon, is they've complied by avoidance. Now, we all know that there's children that are on Facebook. There was a study done, I forget who did it, but they said 5 million plus kids under age 13 on Facebook. My estimate would be a bit higher than that, but it doesn't matter. The point is this: if Facebook had actual knowledge that those kids were on Facebook, they would be in violation of COPPA. So and I need to be careful how I say this, but right now, Facebook, ignorance is bliss, right?
Even if I have an app that has Facebook integration, Facebook would be liable and I wouldn't, or
No, I don't. Facebook would not be liable. You would be liable because you're collecting that information. And was part of your question, are you protected by the fact that Facebook doesn't allow, in theory, kids under age 13?
I'm just asking because I know that kids use Facebook if they
Yeah.
log in, and basically if I'm liable.
Right. Well, you know, the fact is, if the kid lies about his age and he can get access to your application, you have no knowledge that it's a kid using it. You've got reason to believe because they access that application through Facebook, you're probably okay there. But if you get actual knowledge that that kid's under 13, if that kid posts something, then and somebody at your company sees he posted, well, my birthday is tomorrow and I'm going to be 12. Now you need to be concerned. Right?
Okay, thank you.
Keith, I have a question. So
Sure.
let's talk about what happens when you receive actual knowledge, and your strategy to this point has been avoidance. I mean, does this mean that now, do you need to remove that? If you remove that user, is that sort of like, curing the problem, or is it, now that you have actual knowledge, are you sort of forced into the pool of you have to do something about assuming
No.
that your entire population has been compromised by
no.
children?
That's a good question, Dan. The good news is that your liability is to, once you get knowledge that that's a child, is to delete that information and not collect it again. You don't fall into the category, and now you need to comply and have all of your users get COPPA protection. So it's pretty straightforward. It makes sense, actually. Imagine that. Sure.
Okay, I have kind of a strange question. If we are in a situation we are not collecting any information from users,
Right.
what should we be watching out for that we might be doing, ways in which we might be approaching children's privacy without realizing it? Such as IP addresses, device.
Well, but that is
Identities.
that is PII, right? That's in the definition of PII.
Well, so for example, if we have an app that doesn't collect any information, but it includes a URL that a child might click on, in which case, if they go to that website, then their IP address will be collected.
Right. Well, no, I think you're okay there. They're going there from your app. I think you're okay there. I mean,
Well-
the FTC's got lower hanging fruit than you in that
Right.
situation.
Well, I guess my question is, that's an example that we're not worrying about, but are there
Right.
any other sort of in between
Yeah, there's
situations you can think of?
there's in betweens, but I think let me just address the persistent identifiers, because I think that's where the most exposure is. Let me say it again. If it's a cookie, if it's a unique identifier for the device, I don't care whether it's that backpack or it's bicycle or it's the iPad, or what's the other one? I can't even think of it. IP address. You can collect those as long as it's just allow you to operate your internal operations. Meaning you want to protect you want to verify who the users are. You can even personalize the experience for the user, because you know this is a boy who's interested in soccer and he's not interested in playing with dolls, so the next time he comes in, all he sees is soccer stuff, right? But you don't know who the person is, and you're not going to share that information with anybody, you're okay. You can use it for that. That's fine. If you share that with anyone or you do anything outside of that box, now the FTC is interested, okay?
So the question is actually, who are the low-hanging fruits? It's the reason is that a lot of us, we're legacy game development company. We
Yeah.
all had a virtual world that's still hanging in there, and now you've brought back some really traumatic, thoughts in my mind. I've
Sorry.
moved so beyond that business, but it's still there.
Yeah.
And now I'm just saying, oh my gosh, is that future
me?
library? So we've done our bit, but I think we've just got tired of paying the services to people, for a
Sure.
business that didn't make sense.
Sure.
And just to be on the safer side, what are the kind of people that the FTC is persecuting or has on their radar? I mean,
Okay, good question. The short answer to that is I don't know, right? The FTC, since the new changes went into effect in July of last year, they said, we're going to give you six months, and we're not going to come after anybody, right? Well, that 6 months has passed, and they haven't done much since then. But they've been rattling their swords, saying, we're coming, we're coming, we're coming, we're gonna lop off some heads. Everybody's waiting to find out who they're going to go after, right? They went after Amazon. It was loosely tied to COPPA, but not really COPPA. That was $1 million fine. As you may know, in the past, they've gone after some other small companies. Path, back in, I think it was 2012 or 2013, got fined $800,000. Ouch, right? That matters. But who are they going to go after? I really don't know. I'm waiting to see myself, you know. And the rumors are it's going to happen pretty soon, but, you know, I don't know. Sure. Any other? Sure.
So I was wondering why 13 and not like 12.
That's a good
15,
question.
16.
I don't know why. If I maybe went back and read all the old hearings and such when Congress passed this, I could probably find out, but I don't know why. And another thing for you to consider, the EU is watching what's happened with COPPA very closely, and they're following, or they might lead at some point, and they have a different opinion about what the age should be. And you know what that age is? 18. Think of the impact of that, right? So it's another reason to take this seriously. Think about, does it make sense for me to take the road less traveled, get out there now, deal with this, and be ready for it when it happens? Because it's not going away. Right? Now, you know, the next administration might take it out, but, you know, I don't think so. I don't think so.
So you mentioned EU is like 18 or something.
I think
like,
it's 18. It could be
or
17.
Some other different age,
Some other
right?
age,
So,
yes.
like a lot of apps are global, of course. So what do you do? Like, you have two separate rules. Do you only look at it as 13, or should you be looking at it as 18? Like what? How?
Well,
and then also the third-party vendors. Like, do they also cross over to the different countries' regulations as well? Would they also help with those?
Okay, good questions. If it were me, and I'm developing an application, and I want to access as many potential users out there as possible without having to comply with any painful laws, I'm going to differentiate between the U.S. and the EU, right? Because there's no reason for me to apply COPPA rules to 17-year-olds in the U.S. Why exclude them? So I'd be very specific with that. In terms of the services being offered outside the U.S., to my knowledge, I don't know of any that are offered in the U.S. that are offered outside the U.S. today. We are one of those services. We are very closely watching what's happening in the EU because we want to be there when it's time. When that'll be, I don't know. And so when we go there, I can't tell you for sure, but we will go there. Right.
Just one last question. So how can you tell if it's an app for a 13-year-old, under 13, or 15?
Well, you can do an age gate, and you know, and the FTC has very clear opinions about how you do that age gate as well. It can't be leading. You can't just only allow them to select from a list of dates that is limited in any way. But you can ask them. You can say, "How old are you?" And if they lie to you, you've asked the question. You're okay. Kids might lie to you, and that's okay. You don't know, right?
I just one more question.
Sure.
But in terms of the persistent identifiers, there's a lot of different types of identifiers, and they behave in you know many different ways.
Right.
Persistent identifier, is that something where it's persistent across different services, or is it still persistent if it's just persistent if you open let's say it's an application. If you open the application multiple times, it's the same identifier. So what does persistent mean in this context?
Okay. Let me, maybe if I tell you exactly what it is that the FTC is concerned about, it'll help clarify that, and then I'll try to address it directly, right? What the FTC is concerned about is behavioral advertising. That's it. That's really what COPPA is about, right? They don't want you to be able to track that child over different applications or services, so you understand where they've been, you understand what their behaviors are, and now they come to this application, and I know how to put just the right advertisement in front of that child, right? So if if the persistent identifier only lets them know that they're coming back to your application and you're not tracking that child across services over time, you're okay. But as soon as you start tracking over time across services, then the FTC is not going to be accommodating in that regard. Okay, all right. Is that it? Well, thank you all so much. I'm really glad that you hung in there and stayed here to this session. Thank you.